G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we're looking at my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Monaco Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. We're going to get straight into all the key talking points for the weekend, and I think one of the factors that stands out to me in particular at a track like Monaco is how important a good qualifying result can be for your fantasy teams. It's extremely well documented how difficult it is to overtake. At Monaco, we only had 35 overtakes at this circuit last year and a mere, I think, 15 or so in 2022. So it goes to show how difficult it is to not just make passes, but also rack up those extra fantasy points. And as a result of that, you want to target drivers that qualify much better than not just their teammates, but particularly the rest of the grid or those other drivers that kind of sit around them relative to the standings. I think Tsunoda and Hülkenberg are the two drivers in the midfield that stick out to me the most. Tsunoda's qualified in the top 10 in 5 of the 7 races this season, and Hülkenberg's made 4 appearances in Q3. So I fully expect that those two are going to continue the trend heading into Monaco, all things considered. They've also out-qualified their teammates just about every occasion, I think, this year as well. So it bodes for a very encouraging sign, particularly these two guys fighting it out in the midfield. You look at the Saubers, the Williams, the Alpines. None of these teams, I think, except for Bottas, has had a Q3 appearance in 2024. So it speaks to me that Tsunoda and Hülkenberg have got the kind of the pedigree to continue that theme. The other driver I've got here is Max Verstappen, and I think it's very well documented how important it is to have a good qualifier. Max in particular is on a streak of 8 pole positions in a row at a track where he stole provisional pole from Alonso in 2023 in that third sector. So I think Max deserves some thought. The one thing I will say though, at Monaco, where the point ceiling across the board is going to be much lower, is that my thoughts are whoever qualifies P2 behind Max, assuming Max takes pole again, is in with the best shot at the Driver of the Day award. And I wanted to get onto that just for a moment because of how important that can be at a track like Monaco. These guys here are the only winners of the Driver of the Day award. I've excluded Ollie Behrman because he's not a permanent fixture on the grid. But I think given how important that extra 10 points will be at this circuit, it's worth seriously thinking about one of these 3 options as your 2x DRS boost over Max Verstappen. Norris in particular, he's on a streak of 3 in a row. Leclerc won Driver of the Day in Japan after coming from, I think it was around P6 to P4, contending for a podium, and then Sainz won Bahrain and then Australia when he actually did win the race. So I think these 3 drivers have a pretty solid chance of repeating that at Monaco. Piastri also had P2 in MLR. Had it not been for his grid penalty, I thought he would have been in for a decent shout at that as well. So just think about how these guys can factor into your plans for the weekend, because that extra 10 points can be the difference between a good and a great weekend and a bit of extra budget gain if it works in favor of you. One thing in particular I wanted to look at was kind of how that could implicate the final fix chip, which some people have talked about at Monaco. And I've, in this example, used Verstappen and Leclerc as P1 and P2 in qualifying and in the race. I mean, there could be a bunch of other variables where it could be Norris, could be Sainz, Piastri, whatever it might be. But for argument's sake, I've just used these 2. I think one thing to think about is if you do choose to use final fix, the points difference and the budget gain is going to be quite small. So those people who are thinking about going for Verstappen for the qualifying points and then bringing in Leclerc for the race points and the Driver of the Day means that you probably only, as the DRS boost, get around kind of 7 to 8 to 9 points across the entire weekend. And my thoughts here are, is that enough to use a chip like Final Fix? It's hard to say objectively what the right answer is, because I did use it in Monaco last year. I went from Perez when he started P20 to Sainz, who was much further up the grid. That netted me 0 points ultimately because Sainz spun out in the wet weather when the rain came through. But I think realistically, going for this kind of approach could pay off. But I think it's more in the case where if your pole position driver or the driver, sorry, that you have is your 2x DRS boost has an absolute stinker of a qualifying session. They hit the wall or they're out in Q1. Then you could final fix someone that's further up the grid in kind of P1 to P3 into your team, depending on how much extra point ceiling they have on the Saturday. So I put this poll to everyone on X, on Twitter. It was a pretty split vote, if I'm being completely honest. So I was surprised by how close it was. I think the budget versus the points on offer is so negligible. The difference is so minor that it's really a to or a fro as to what approach some may want to take. But I suppose the fact that for me, there's also chips on the table such as autopilot, which Mike has asked this question here. The fact that wildcard may come into play for me as well. I could also wait one extra week in terms of a Red Bull coverage. And then I think as well, given this example I've made here where Sainz had that did not start -20 because of that fuel issue he had last year in Qatar, makes me think there could be a scenario further on in the season where the final fix becomes more valuable and saves you 20 points or whatever it might be, as opposed to maybe 7 or 8 at a track like Monaco. So just some food for thought. I don't necessarily think that using the final fix is the absolute best or worst approach to Monaco. I think there's a very good case to make for using it at this track compared to most others, but there's also the factor of signs or whatever instance that could arise later in the season where there's an issue that stops your DRS boost driver from actually participating in the race on Sunday. So just think about that and how that could factor into your fantasy plans. So I think coming back to that, it probably means that my approach, particularly for the weekend, will be going for a driver not named Max Verstappen in my team, unless, of course, again, it's just too hard in the practice sessions to land on a Ferrari or a McLaren driver. We could see Max kind of P1, P2 through all free practice sessions, and then Sainz, Leclerc, Norris kind of anywhere between P1 and P10, P15, which I don't see happening, but in the off chance that does happen, that would be the one small circumstance where I don't move for one of these three drivers. In terms of the weather, there is expectations of some rain coming through on the Saturday. I think otherwise it's going to be a pretty dry weekend across the board, but I think what that means for qualifying is that we could see a spanner in the works with what we expect from performance on track for a single lap and how that determines the grid for the Sunday. So just think about that as well. I don't know. There's not really a right answer as to how to tackle the wet weather, but maybe having that final fixed chip probably could be one such method of mitigating that risk. The other approach would be potentially autopilot. The example before on that tweet I was showing you where, there could be a team where you're running Piastri and Sainz or Piastri and Leclerc, whatever it might be. Ultimately, what that could mean for if you've got two drivers, that could be anywhere between P1 and P5 or lower, kind of how the points could shake out for them. So keep that in mind, but I think it'll be a pretty uneventful race on Sunday if weather holds, which it seems to be the case as it stands. So I've obviously talked about the 2x DRS boost option. I think Verstappen and Leclerc, I've talked about what that means for qualifying, and then you've got Norris, Sainz. Piastri could be another name you add to the list here, depending on how he qualifies or looks in practice. But I think realistically, these are the four names that stick out to me as who I'll slap with the 2x on. For chip strategy, we've talked about final fix, and then wildcard for me, an option given I have 0 Red Bull at the moment. I gambled in Imola, didn't quite pay off, but again, not the end of the world. I've got a wildcard that I have in my pocket if I need to fix that. And then there was obviously the example I referenced before around autopilot. So I think there's realistically a number of different chips, but definitely not the time to be using your 3x or your limitless. There's just not enough points on the table to justify that. So I think unless there's some really serious surprises in Monaco, that these two chips and potentially autopilot are probably the ones to me that stand out the most. So I want to lastly look at how my team is shaping up for the weekend. For those of you that have watched my team selection video, this is kind of the bones of what I've got for Monaco. And I could do the most simple approach would be to just use one trade, roll back the Sainz, Piastri, McLaren and Ferrari combination if I think there's enough shown in free practice to suggest that. If Perez looks awfully out of sorts again, I'm not so sure that could be the case, but I think between these two guys, Ferrari and McLaren, there's a few points on the table there, and I could easily just make the move from Albon into Hülkenberg, one of the good qualifiers I mentioned before. But I think realistically, I probably will be a little more reactive to free practice. So assuming this team holds firm and I choose not to go down the wildcard route because I think there could be a case for final fix, then the most likely approach for me would be something like, if Perez looks awfully out of sorts, but Ferrari and McLaren are kind of jumbled between P2, P6, P7, then the most obvious move for me would be Max Verstappen and then someone like Hülkenberg or Tsunoda. The reason why I'd probably, for me, pick Hülkenberg is because I'd want to have just a little bit more budget in Canada to pivot out of these drivers here. I just don't think Williams is the pick at all at the moment. Albon's kind of in free fall in terms of value and performance, and the reliability for that team is by no means great. And then obviously Sauber as well, not looking so great. So that's probably why I'm currently leaning Hulk over Tsunoda, but you could also go for Tsunoda easily in 2 moves. I've got probably 10 different combinations of drivers I'm going for here. So if Sainz and Piastri are on the chopping board, the other move for me would make sense for like Leclerc, for instance. Let's say I think he's confident he can break the Monaco curse. I think he, among all drivers behind Verstappen, is expected to be the best for P2. He's got 3 P2s this season, the most among all drivers. But fascinatingly, he has got 3 P2s, but Lando Norris has outqualified him 4-3 in races in qualifying sessions so far this season. So unless Charles gets P2, Norris tends to outqualify him, which is quite an interesting stat, but something to keep in mind. And then that would leave me enough for something like, I don't know, Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, neither of which jump out off the page at me just because they've had some pretty mixed results so far this season. Alonso's coming off one of his worst ever Grand Prix results, but he did have provisional pole here in Monaco last year. And then Hamilton, just not really screaming value to me at all at 19.4, but obviously with my budget, just enough to squeeze him in if I felt compelled to. Now, there are probably going to be people with more budget, and if you can run a Piastri Leclerc, I really like that. I do think I could myself, would I have enough to do something like that if I just drop Piastri in? What if I transferred Albon out? I think it would be something like Leclerc and Sargent. So I could do something like this. I also don't hate that. I like Leclerc. I might end up doing something like that too in 2 moves. I mean, Sargent and Sauber, absolute dog's breakfast of a budget or backmarker lineup. But I think as long as Sargent doesn't DNF, then it's feasible. But I think that's probably some other options there for me. In terms of wildcard, I think there's probably the case to be made to completely clear out all of this deadwood. If I just refresh the page one more time, I'm not going to keep harping on about it because people may have a very different approach to me. But if I do ultimately go down wildcard, it would be something like binning off, I think, most of this team. It would be a -20. So at that point, I think you can't not go for wildcard, and then get in, the Sauber, the Haas guys, Yuki Tsunoda and Charles Leclerc. So I think what I like about this is you get a good qualifier in Charles Leclerc. You get 2 midfield drivers that are also excellent qualifiers, and then K-Mag and Bottas, for me, they are typically kind of Q1 exits, if not Q1, definitely Q2 exits. So I think you're getting 2 experienced drivers that have raced at Monaco several times now and will typically qualify further back. So they're just relying on DNFs further up the field to make points up at a track like Monaco. They're also excellent options for Canada and Spain, where there's going to be more overtakes on the table. So I definitely think having a rollback of these 2 guys for an extra race week is probably good. Now, the one factor I haven't really considered would be if Perez looks good in free practice and that performance in Imola from him is a red herring. Now, at that point, then I could potentially think about going for a Red Bull constructor. I'm just not sure yet if it is the right move as of right now. It could be, I mean, they're fast pit stops, 10 up to 18 fast pit stops in any race weekend for Red Bull. They are the kind of the dominant force in that department. But I could go for in something like this. It would leave a little bit of extra budget on the table, but the reason why I want to carry this budget an extra week would be that I could get to Max Verstappen in 2 moves in Canada if the opportunity came to that. So, Charles Leclerc and Yuki Tsunoda would come out in Canada, and then Max and Logan would come in and kind of be back to the old meta of sorts for Canada. If it looked like Red Bull, like Perez and Verstappen, were back to their old ways. So that's some option there to think about. But a lot of different variables. I know I've talked a lot about my team selection, but trying to give myself as many options as possible so I don't go into the deadline kind of frantically panicking like I was on the deadline stream last week. And speaking of that, I'll be back with FanAmp. Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, myself, and Terry from F1 Coffee Corner will be digesting the latest raft of talking points, upgrades, kind of track layout, and what that means for all of the teams heading into the weekend. So be sure to drop by on FanAmp's YouTube channel. Links are in the description below for all the details on that. So we'll talk things for an hour. Drop your teams in there. We'll answer them live on stream. But I'll leave it there for now, guys. As always, greatly appreciate your help and support on the channel. It's meant a great deal to me so far through 7 races, and I'm really looking forward to continuing that into this season. But if I don't see you on the deadline stream, good luck with your teams this weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.